Mara had spent years believing mercy was something weak people could not afford. Then she found a wounded cowboy alone in the rain and chose to save him anyway. She cleaned his wound, covered him with her only dry blanket, and expected nothing in return. But when dawn touched his saddle, an old mark appeared in the leather, and every memory she had buried came rushing back with one terrible question. 15 years earlier, Bell Creek Ranch had been small enough for Mara to know every gate by the sound of its hinge. Her father, Gideon Bell, kept fewer cattle than the wealthy outfits north of Red Hollow, but every animal was counted, branded, and entered by hand into a ledger he guarded more carefully than money. He had taught Mara that numbers could lie only when people made them lie, and that a rancher who stopped checking his own books had already begun giving his land away. That was why the night of the fire never made sense to her. Mara had been 16 when orange light woke her against the bedroom wall. By the time she reached the yard, the barn roof was burning and frightened horses were tearing against their ropes. Through the smoke, she saw a saddled horse standing beyond the east fence where no bell hand had any reason to be. On its tack was a dark mark shaped like a broken spur. The rider was gone before anyone reached the fence. By morning, men from Red Hollow had found stolen cattle penned near Bell Creek. Since several brands had been altered, papers bearing Gideon Bell's name were discovered among the ranch records, and the same broken spur mark appeared on equipment that no one in the Bell family remembered owning. Gideon insisted that the cattle had been driven onto his land and the papers planted before the fire. Few listened. Silas Mercer did. At the time, Mercer was still building his cattle business, buying stock for larger outfits and arranging shipments toward the rail lines. He spoke with the confidence of a man who always seemed to know which paper mattered and which witness should be believed. His testimony placed Gideon near cattle, later identified as stolen, and the story spread faster than the truth could defend itself. By winter, Bell Creek was spoken of as a rustler's ranch. The bank took the land. Neighbors stopped meeting Gideon's eyes. Men who had once eaten at his table crossed the street rather than be seen greeting him. Mara lost more than a home. She lost the right to enter a room without someone measuring her against her father's disgrace. Gideon never stopped denying the charge. He spent the years that followed writing letters, comparing sale records, and searching for shipments that might prove where the stolen cattle had actually come from. He died before he could clear his name. What remained to Mara was one scorched ledger page, folded so many times the edges had gone soft. Across it ran several cattle lot numbers written in Gideon's careful hand, followed by weights and tiny dots placed to the right. He had used that system whenever he suspected a count had been changed after leaving his ranch. Mara kept the page hidden inside the lining of her traveling case. She also kept the name Bell. It cost her work. Boarding house owners became colder after hearing it. Ranch offices that needed someone who could read invoices suddenly found no position available. Storekeepers lowered their voices when she entered, and old stories followed her through Red Hollow as faithfully as a shadow. Still, she never begged anyone to believe her. She worked where she could, learned cattle prices, freight charges, land filings, and bills of sale, and waited for the day when knowledge might be worth more than reputation. That was why she had returned to Red Hollow, not for sympathy, not to reclaim Bell Creek through some impossible miracle. She wanted the old county records that had never been shown to her father and the names attached to the cattle shipments from the weeks before the fire. If Gideon had been framed, then somewhere beneath 15 years of dust there had to be a mistake the guilty man had failed to bury. Now there was another mistake. A saddle, supposedly belonging to a man dead since 1882, carried a hidden date from 1884. The same broken spur mark that Mara had seen beyond Bell Creek's burning fence had been cut into its fender. And somewhere inside her traveling case, Gideon Bell's scorched page still held a row of cattle numbers that had never belonged to any sale recorded under his name. Mara had spent half her life being told those numbers meant nothing. She was beginning to believe they had been waiting for her to find the place where they appeared again. By midday, Caleb could stand without collapsing, but the wound beneath his ribs made every movement careful. Mara had no reason to trust him, yet leaving an injured man alone beside a flooded trail would have made her no better than the people who had once watched her family fall and chosen silence. She helped him saddle the calmer horse and followed him toward Cedar Ridge. The ranch sat beneath a long ridge of pine and stone, larger than Bell Creek had ever been but worn at the edges. Several fence rails needed replacing. One barn door sagged on its hinge. The corrals held good cattle, though fewer than a ranch that size should have carried. Mara noticed all of it before Caleb reached the porch. She intended to leave as soon as she knew he would live. Caleb gave her no reason to hurry. He did not ask why a Bell woman had been alone on the road. He did not demand an explanation for the way she had stared at his saddle. He arranged a small room at the back of the house, left clean blankets there, and made certain she had food before discussing anything else. The kindness unsettled Mara more than suspicion would have. She had learned how to defend herself against cruelty. She knew how to endure a closed door, a whispered insult, or a ranch owner suddenly deciding there was no work after learning her surname. Caleb offered none of those familiar battles. Instead, he treated the help she had given him as something that deserved to be repaid without turning gratitude into a debt she could never escape. The next morning, he showed her the ranch office. Receipts, cattle tallies, freight bills, and feed invoices had been stacked across an old desk while Caleb recovered. His handwriting was orderly, but several months of records had never been properly compared. He needed someone who could organize them until he was strong enough to return to full work. Mara understood the offer immediately. It was wages, not charity. She accepted enough days to earn money for her next lodging and told herself that was the only reason she remained at Cedar Ridge. It was not entirely true. The saddle stayed locked in the tack room. Caleb remembered Nathan using it years earlier. After Nathan died in December of 1882, family tack and equipment had passed through several hands while Caleb struggled to keep the ranch running. He could not explain the date beneath the lining. More troubling, he admitted that for a long stretch after Nathan's death, he could not remember seeing that saddle at all. Mara did not accuse him. She watched. She studied the ranch, the accounts, and the quiet way Caleb allowed her space, without pretending the questions between them did not exist. Each day made it harder to fit him into the kind of man she had imagined behind the broken spur mark. Then, late one afternoon, she began sorting a bundle of old cattle receipts. Halfway down one page, her fingers stopped. The cattle count came first. The weight followed. At the far right sat a tiny dot, placed exactly where Gideon Bell had always marked, a number he believed had been altered. Mara reached for the scorched ledger page hidden inside her traveling case. For the first time in 15 years, her father's private system had appeared in someone else's books. Mara waited until Caleb was outside checking the north corral before she returned to the tack room. The saddle rested where he had left it, untouched since the morning she found the hidden date beneath the lining. In daylight, the broken spur mark looked less like an old ranch brand and more like something forced into the leather after years of wear. She carried it to the window and cleaned the fender with a dry cloth. Dirt lifted from the cuts. Beneath the blackened grooves, another pattern began to appear. A straight bar crossed what remained of an older letter. Mara traced the shape without pressing hard. It was not part of the broken spur at all. When Caleb returned, she showed him what she had found. He recognized the buried mark as the old Hale Bar H, the brand his father had used on tack long before Caleb inherited Cedar Ridge. That meant the saddle had once carried the Hale family mark openly. Someone had later cut the broken spur over it and darkened the grooves until the original symbol nearly disappeared. The stitching told a second story. One seam along the fender had faded almost gray with age. Another line used darker thread and tighter spacing. Mara had seen enough repaired harness and saddle leather to know they were not made at the same time. The portion carrying the broken spur had been replaced after the rest of the saddle was already worn. She refused to pull the seam apart. If the saddle mattered, destroying the stitching before a witness saw it could destroy the value of whatever they found. Instead, she returned to the ranch office. The cattle receipts that had stopped her the previous evening were still spread across the desk. Mara placed Gideon Bell's scorched ledger page beside them. The systems were not identical, yet one detail refused to leave her alone. Both used a tiny dot beside figures that had been changed after an original count. Caleb finally asked why a mark on a saddle frightened her more than the wound that had nearly killed him. Mara gave him the truth she had protected for 15 years. The broken spur had appeared at Bell Creek on the night the barn burned. By morning, equipment carrying the same symbol had been presented as evidence against Gideon Bell. Men had called it proof that her father belonged to a rustling operation. Mara had been 16, but she still remembered seeing the mark outside the fence before the sheriff ever claimed to find it among her father's property. Caleb did not defend his family. He did not ask Mara to forget what she remembered. He simply locked the saddle away again and agreed that no seam would be opened until someone could identify the repair. For Mara, that restraint mattered. If you were standing where Mara was, would you believe Caleb truly knew nothing about the saddle, or would you suspect he was protecting an old Hale secret? Share your judgment in the comments. That evening, Caleb searched through old ranch inventories and tried to remember who had controlled the tack room after Nathan died. The answer came slowly, tied to a period Caleb had spent away buying replacement cattle after a brutal winter. During those months, one man had been trusted with Cedar Ridge equipment, shipments, and purchasing records: Silas Mercer. Silas Mercer's name changed the way Mara looked at every page in the Cedar Ridge office. Until then, the missing money could have been carelessness, bad seasons, or ordinary mistakes. Now she began with the cattle themselves. She compared Caleb's herd counts with freight receipts from the rail depot, then placed the final sales statements beside them. The numbers appeared respectable until she stopped reading each paper alone. Cedar Ridge was sending the correct number of cattle, but the recorded sale weights were repeatedly lower than the figures taken before shipment. Small differences appeared harmless. Repeated across dozens of animals, they became hundreds of dollars. Nearly every disputed shipment passed through Mercer Cattle Company. Mara worked backward through 6 months of records. Some cattle had been charged twice for handling. Others carried unexplained deductions for feed they had never received. A few invoices listed animals as damaged stock, even though Caleb's ranch tallies recorded them as healthy when they left Cedar Ridge. The pattern was too careful to look like theft. That was what made it dangerous. A thief who took 20 cattle from a pasture left an empty field behind. A man who stole through paper could make the rancher believe drought, weak prices, and bad luck had taken the money instead. Caleb had another shipment scheduled within 2 days. Mara asked him to delay it long enough to count every animal and record the weights before the herd left Cedar Ridge. They checked brands, numbers, and condition against the contract Mercer had provided. The contract contained the same hidden weakness. The buyer could adjust the final weight after delivery while still charging Cedar Ridge for the original handling costs. Under poor conditions, Caleb might have accepted the loss as ordinary market trouble. With Mara showing him the earlier receipts side by side, the difference became impossible to ignore. Caleb canceled the shipment. For the first time since Mara arrived, her work changed more than a page in a ledger. It kept cattle on Cedar Ridge and stopped money from leaving with them. She built a new system that afternoon. Every animal would be counted before departure. Weight figures would be copied twice. Brand records would remain at Cedar Ridge instead of traveling only with the buyer. No final invoice would be accepted unless it matched the ranch copy. The simplicity of it troubled Mara. Her father had taught her almost the same method. That thought sent her back to Gideon's scorched page. She placed it beside an old Cedar Ridge shipment book and followed the strange sequence of lot numbers, one digit at a time. One series matched. Not approximately. Exactly. The same cattle lot structure Gideon had marked before Bell Creek burned appeared again in Cedar Ridge records years later, attached to shipments handled through Mercer. Mara felt the old shame inside her begin to change shape. For 15 years, people had treated Gideon's notes as the desperate scribbling of a guilty man. Now those notes were describing a system still being used. Caleb brought out older Hale ledgers from a locked cabinet, records dating back to the years after Nathan's death. Mara searched until fading daylight forced her closer to the window. Then she found an entry from June of 1884. Beside a cattle transfer connected to Mercer was the same altered lot system, followed by 2 initials written in dark ink, N.H. Mara stared at them until the room seemed to narrow around the page. Nathan Hale had been dead for 18 months. The days after the canceled shipment settled into a quieter rhythm at Cedar Ridge. Caleb healed slowly enough to resent the weakness, but wisely enough not to ignore it. Mara began working before sunrise, and each morning a cup of hot coffee appeared beside the ledgers before she reached the office. Caleb never mentioned leaving it there. Mara never thanked him aloud. The small kindness became part of the ranch as naturally as the creak of the barn doors. She returned the favor without announcing it. One evening she noticed the seam of Caleb's work coat had split beneath the shoulder. The next morning the coat hung where he had left it, the tear repaired with strong thread and the worn lining reinforced. He studied the stitching for a moment, then simply put it on and went outside. Neither of them needed the gesture explained. Mara had spent years expecting kindness to come with a question attached. Caleb asked for nothing. He did not demand the history she had not offered, and when she startled at the sound of a horse crossing the yard after dark, he did not force her to explain why. He only checked the gate, made certain no stranger had entered, and returned to his work. One night, rain trapped them in the barn after the cattle had been settled. Water drummed against the roof while Caleb rested his injured side against a post and Mara checked a nervous mare. For several minutes there was nothing between them but the sound of rain and the steady breathing of horses. Mara realized she felt safe. The thought frightened her more than the storm. The following morning, Caleb placed the key to the ranch office beside her coffee. With it came access to the locked cabinet containing the oldest Hale records. He was giving her the one thing men in Red Hollow had refused her for 15 years, permission to look at the truth without deciding beforehand what she would find. That afternoon, Mara opened her traveling case and removed Gideon Bell's scorched ledger page. Until then, no one else had been allowed to hold it. She placed it in Caleb's hands. Together, they compared Gideon's cattle lot numbers with the Cedar Ridge records carrying the initials NH. The same sequence appeared across several years and repeatedly passed through one rail depot used by Mercer Cattle Company. The connection was real, but another detail bothered Mara. She found an older family receipt signed by Nathan Hale while he was still alive and set it beside the 1,884 entry. The handwriting was wrong. Nathan formed his N with a narrow first stroke and a sharp angle at the center. The initials in the later ledger were broader, rounded, almost carefully imitated. Someone had not merely continued using Nathan's name after his death. Someone had tried to make Dead Man's handwriting look convincing. Caleb opened every remaining file he had. Mara no longer felt like a guest searching another family's secrets. For the first time, they were searching together. Near dawn, the rain finally stopped. The ranch yard lay silver beneath a clearing sky when the sound of wagon wheels came from the road. Mara stepped onto the porch beside Caleb. A black wagon was moving toward the gate. Painted on its side were the words Mercer Cattle Company. The black wagon stopped outside the Cedar Ridge gate just after sunrise. Silas Mercer stepped down wearing a dark coat too clean for the muddy road and carrying a leather document case beneath one arm. Two men remained near the wagon, not hired guns exactly, but the sort of employees meant to remind everyone that Mercer rarely arrived without weight behind his name. Mara recognized him before Caleb did. 15 years had silvered his hair and thickened his waist. Yet nothing had changed in the calm certainty of his face. He still looked like a man who expected paper to become truth simply because he held it. Silas noticed Mara standing beside Caleb. For the first time, his expression changed. Only slightly, but Mara saw it. He had not expected Gideon Bell's daughter to be inside Cedar Ridge. Silas produced a debt claim stating that Caleb had pledged cattle and a section of western grazing land as security against advances made through Mercer Cattle Company. According to the papers, missed payments gave Mercer the right to demand settlement. If the debt could not be paid, the land could be placed into auction. Caleb read every page before reacting. Mara watched the figures. The numbers were arranged with the same careful appearance she had learned to distrust. Fees hid inside freight adjustments. Previous cattle losses were listed as unpaid balances. The very shortages she now believed Mercer had created were being used as evidence that Cedar Ridge owed him money. Then Silas turned his attention to Mara. He reminded Caleb, who her father had been in the eyes of Red Hollow, Gideon Bell, convicted in public memory, if not by any clean truth, a suspected rustler, a man whose ranch had collapsed beneath accusations of stolen cattle. Silas suggested that Mara's sudden interest in Hale records came from revenge, not honesty. The old humiliation returned quickly. Mara felt it in the silence from the ranch hands beyond the yard and in the familiar pressure to defend a dead man before anyone would listen to the living woman standing in front of them. But she did not plead. She asked to see the final page. At the bottom of the debt agreement was a witness notation carrying the initials N.H. Beside it sat a date from the spring of 1884. Nathan Hale had been dead more than a year. Mara showed Caleb without touching the signature. Silas dismissed the problem as an old clerical transfer, the kind of error that occurred when agreements were copied between company books. But Caleb had already seen the false initials in his own ledger. One impossible signature might have been carelessness. Two made a pattern. Silas gave Caleb an easy way out. Mara could leave Cedar Ridge, Mercer could review the debt privately, and the matter did not have to become a public embarrassment. Caleb refused without raising his voice. No cattle would leave the ranch. No acre would be surrendered. No debt would be accepted until the county clerk and Sheriff Reed examined every signature and date. He did not promise Mara that she was right. He did something more important. He refused to declare her wrong simply because Silas Mercer was richer. If you were in Caleb's place, would you risk the ranch to give Mara the chance no one ever gave her father? Share your answer in the comments. Silas closed the document case. Before climbing back into the wagon, he left one final notice on the porch. Unless the debt was overturned, proceedings would begin to place Cedar Ridge land at auction. The wagon disappeared down the road. Caleb picked up the notice. Mara looked at the date. They had only days to prove that a dead man had been made to sign the papers that could take Cedar Ridge away. Caleb did not spend the next morning arguing with Mercer's notice. He wrapped the saddle in canvas, placed it in the wagon, and took Mara straight to Sheriff Reed. That decision surprised her. A man trying to protect an old family secret would have hidden the saddle. Caleb did the opposite. He asked Reed to record the broken spur mark, the buried Hale bar H, the date beneath the lining, and the two different rows of stitching before anyone touched the leather again. Reed listened without promising that any of it proved fraud, but the impossible date on Mercer's debt papers was enough for him to witness the examination and send them to the county records office. There, Caleb found the inventory made after Nathan's death. The saddle was listed among Hale property in early 1883, weeks after Nathan had been buried. It remained in the tackroom records until the following year, when a faded removal slip showed that someone had signed it out along with other equipment. Mara read the name twice, Silas Mercer. At the time, Mercer had been temporarily managing purchases and shipments for Cedar Ridge, while Caleb was away replacing cattle lost during a brutal winter. The record proved Mercer had possession of Nathan's saddle before the mysterious June 1884 date appeared beneath its lining. It was not enough to convict him, but it was no longer coincidence. The stitching became their next lead. An elderly clerk recognized the dark thread as material once favored by Elias Boone, a saddle maker who had worked in Red Hollow for decades. Boone's shop stood at the far end of town beneath a weathered sign almost hidden by dust. Elias examined the saddle slowly. He recognized his own stitch spacing before he remembered the repair itself. The fender had been replaced many years earlier. He was certain because he had used a particular waxed thread for only a short period after losing his usual supplier. Mara asked nothing that might shape his memory. She let the leather do the questioning. Elias searched through boxes of old repair books while Caleb waited without touching the saddle. Nearly an hour passed before the old man pulled out a ledger from 1884. A June entry recorded repair work on a Hale saddle. The customer's name had been left blank. Elias traced a thick finger over the empty line. He didn't know the man's name, but he remembered the night. The stranger had arrived after dark, paid double the usual rate in crisp cash, and demanded the fender replaced before sunrise. He strictly ordered Elias not to record his name or ask questions. A careful man would have left no trail at all. But Mara knew that a man obsessed with money could never completely ignore a ledger. She asked Elias for the exact amount paid that night. The old saddlemaker pointed to the margin, $4.50. Mara immediately turned to the box of Cedar Ridge records Caleb had brought to the sheriff's office. She pulled out the expense ledger from June 1884, the exact month Silas Mercer had been temporarily managing Caleb's accounts. She ran her finger down the columns of feed and hardware purchases until she stopped at the exact date Elias had written. There it was. Hidden among ordinary ranch expenses was a cash withdrawal authorized by the temporary manager. The description read only, "Miscellaneous equipment repair." The amount was exactly $4.50. Silas had been too careful to leave his name at the saddlemaker's shop, but his rigid habit of balancing his books had betrayed him. He had used Cedar Ridge's own money to pay for the cover-up. Elias studied the saddle again, then pointed toward the repaired lining. The fender had not merely been replaced. Something had been left beneath it before the leather was sewn closed. Sheriff Reed refused to let anyone open the saddle until Elias Boone had written down what he remembered. The old saddlemaker recorded the June 1884 repair, the replaced fender, the unusual thread, and the faded initials beside the payment. Only then did he place the saddle on his workbench and cut the later stitches. Beneath the repaired lining lay a folded strip of oilcloth. Sheriff Reed took it before anyone unfolded it. Inside were rows of cattle numbers. Mara recognized the system almost immediately. Counts came first, weights followed, and small dots marked figures changed after the original tally. It was nearly identical to the method Gideon Bell had used on the scorched ledger page she had carried for 15 years. But the handwriting belonged to Nathan Hale. The earliest entries had been made before Nathan died. They showed cattle moving through a holding pen south of Red Hollow, disappearing from normal sales records, then returning under altered lot numbers. Beside several transfers was one name, Mercer. Mara placed Gideon's surviving page beside Nathan's tally. One sequence matched exactly, then another. The cattle found at Bell Creek after the fire had not originated on Gideon's ranch. Nathan's notes showed those same lots passing through a holding pen controlled by Silas Mercer before appearing on Bell land. Someone had not discovered stolen cattle at Bell Creek. Someone had brought them there. Gideon's old markings suddenly made sense. Her father had not been recording cattle he intended to steal. He had been tracking numbers that no longer matched the animals moving through nearby sales. Nathan discovered the same method years later. His notes showed cattle from smaller ranches passing through Mercer buyers, losing weight on paper, changing lot numbers, and returning inside different transactions. The broken spur mark gave the scheme a false identity whenever suspicion needed to fall somewhere else. Tack could be planted. Brands could be altered. Records could make a victim look guilty. That explained why Nathan hid the tally inside his saddle. A ledger could disappear. A saddle traveled with its owner. Nathan died before he could bring the evidence forward. After his death, Silas gained access to Hale equipment, while Caleb was away rebuilding the herd. County records proved Mercer had taken the saddle from the tack room. Elias's repair book and the Cedar Ridge expense ledger completed the trail. Silas had paid to replace the damaged fender in June 1884, leaving no name but foolishly recording the exact cost in Caleb's accounts. The broken spur was then cut over the older Hale Bar H. Silas had tried to turn Nathan's saddle into another false trail. He had never known Nathan's evidence was already sealed beneath the leather. Sheriff Reed placed Mercer's debt claim beside the hidden tally and Cedar Ridge records. The same pattern appeared again. Cattle weights were lowered after shipment. Artificial shortages became unpaid balances. Those balances became debt. Once the ranch appeared unable to pay, Mercer could use that debt to take the land. What destroyed Bell Creek was being done to Cedar Ridge. Only this time Mara could trace the chain. For 15 years, Gideon's scorched ledger page had looked like the final defense of a disgraced man. Nathan Hale's hidden tally changed that. Two men, years apart, had followed the same numbers toward Silas Mercer. The Bell and Hale families had never been enemies. They had been victims of the same thief. Caleb looked at the saddle that had once made Mara fear him. The mark she believed connected his family to Bell Creek's ruin had actually been carved over evidence left by a Hale trying to expose the truth. Reed had enough to stop an immediate seizure of Cedar Ridge, but he wanted Nathan's tally checked against county files and surviving rail records before accusing Mercer publicly. Silas had spent 15 years building a reputation strong enough to survive rumors. Rumors would not bring him down. Documents might. The Cedar Ridge auction was scheduled before the courthouse steps. That was where Sheriff Reed intended the truth to meet Silas Mercer. By the time the Cedar Ridge auction was called, nearly half of Red Hollow had gathered before the courthouse. Silas Mercer stood beside the clerk's table, looking like a man who believed the ending had already been decided. Mara remained beside Caleb, carrying Gideon Bell's scorched ledger page. Sheriff Reed stopped the auction before the first bid. He began with Nathan Hale's death record, December 1882. Then came the Hale inventory, proving Nathan's saddle remained at Cedar Ridge after his death, followed by the removal slip showing Silas Mercer later took possession of it. Elias Boone's repair ledger came next. It confirmed the June 1884 fender replacement, the request to leave the owner's name off the main repair line, and the exact cost of the late-night work. Then Mara opened the Cedar Ridge expense book from that same month. She showed the crowd where Silas Mercer, acting as temporary manager, had logged that exact amount on the exact same day for miscellaneous equipment repair. He had paid for his cover-up using Hale money. The broken spur mark had been cut over the original Hale bar H after Nathan was already dead. Then Sheriff Reed unfolded Nathan's hidden cattle tally. The numbers matched Gideon Bell's scorched ledger page. County files and surviving rail records showed the same cattle lots moving through a holding pen connected to Mercer before stolen animals appeared at Bell Creek. Gideon had not been recording cattle he intended to steal. He had been tracing altered numbers that led toward the man who later testified against him. The evidence did not end there. Recent Cedar Ridge records showed the same method. Cattle left the ranch at one weight and appeared on Mercer paperwork at another. False shortages became unpaid balances. Those balances became debt, and the debt was being used to force Cedar Ridge toward auction. The county clerk examined Mercer's debt claim. The initials N.H. appeared on documents dated after Nathan Hale's death. The debt could not stand. The auction was canceled. For the first time, Mercer's confidence disappeared. Sheriff Reed detained him while the county opened an investigation into forgery, fraudulent cattle transfers, and the theft scheme surrounding Cedar Ridge. Other ranchers in the crowd began asking to have their own Mercer records examined, but Mara barely watched Silas. The county clerk reopened the old Bell Creek file before witnesses. The official record was amended to state that evidence used against Gideon Bell had been compromised by manipulated cattle records and planted property. The years Gideon had lost could never be retained. His name could. No applause followed. Mara did not need it. The silence of people who had once whispered the Bell name with contempt was enough. Caleb stood beside her without claiming the victory. Nathan had hidden the tally. Elias had preserved the repair record. Sheriff Reed had protected the evidence. But Mara had understood what the numbers meant. The woman Red Hollow had dismissed as a rustler's daughter had uncovered the truth that saved Cedar Ridge. If this moment of justice stayed with you, share this story with someone who believes a person's name should never be destroyed by a lie. Like, save the video, and subscribe for more stories about courage, second chances, and truth finally being heard. By late afternoon, Mara walked toward the wagon carrying her father's ledger page. For 15 years, she had needed it to prove Gideon Bell deserved his name. Now, his name was clean. Cedar Ridge was safe. And Mara finally had nothing left to run from. That freedom left one question she had never been allowed to ask before. She no longer needed Caleb Hale's ranch. Now she had to decide whether she wanted it to become her home. The weeks after the courthouse felt almost unfamiliar to Mara. Nothing dramatic happened at Cedar Ridge. No wagon arrived with threats. No sheriff came carrying another document. No one stood at the gate, demanding that she explain who her father had been. The ranch simply began to breathe again. Caleb reopened the cattle contracts Mara had stopped him from signing. New weight records were kept in duplicate. Every shipment left Cedar Ridge with a ranch copy of its tally, and no buyer was allowed to change a figure without explanation. The system was simple, careful, and almost exactly the kind Gideon Bell had once taught his daughter to trust. Caleb asked Mara to remain and manage the books permanently, not as hired help, as a partner. She did not answer immediately. For most of her life, staying somewhere had meant depending on the mercy of people who could change their minds. Caleb understood that before she said it. He told her the wages she had earned were hers. If she wanted to leave Red Hollow, he would take her to the station himself. If she wanted to reclaim land somewhere else, he would help her examine every deed before she bought it. There was no debt hidden inside his kindness. That was what finally made Mara understand what Cedar Ridge had become. She remembered the first coffee he had left beside the ledgers before dawn. The room with a lock that belonged only to her. The office key placed quietly beside her cup. The way he had allowed her to question the Hale family without asking her to apologize for it. Caleb had never needed Mara to be helpless before he protected her. And Mara had never needed him to save her from the truth. They had found it together. One evening, Caleb carried Nathan's saddle back into the tack room. The broken spur fender remained attached. Neither of them wanted it destroyed. Sheriff Reed had released it after the evidence had been copied and recorded, and Caleb decided the saddle should remain exactly as it was. Beside it, he hung a fresh piece of leather, carrying the original Hale Bar H. Mara watched him for a moment, then returned to the house and brought out Gideon's scorched ledger page. She had kept it hidden for 15 years. This time, she did not put it back into her traveling case. She placed it inside the Cedar Ridge records box. The past did not disappear. It simply stopped owning the future. A few days later, Caleb asked whether she had decided where she wanted to go. Mara looked across the corrals, the repaired fence, and the office window where a lamp already burned against the evening. For years, she had imagined freedom as leaving every place that knew her name. Now freedom meant being able to stay without surrendering herself. She chose Cedar Ridge. Months later, she and Caleb were married in a small ceremony in Red Hollow. There was no grand celebration and no need for one. The people who mattered stood with them. The rest could learn, in time, that the Bell name belonged to an honest woman and the Hale name belonged beside it. By late summer, Cedar Ridge no longer felt like the lonely ranch Mara had first entered, with suspicion in her heart. There was work at the table, coffee before dawn, 2 coats beside the door instead of 1, and in the tack room hung the saddle that had once made Mara believe she had saved the wrong man. She understood it differently now. The mark on its fender had not brought her back to the family that destroyed hers. It had led her to the truth, and the truth had led her home.